Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Last week, when Putin singled out Americans he'd like to have sent to Russia for interrogation, a lot of attention was focused on former U.S. Ambassador Michael McFaul. He also mentioned others, including very prominent international businessman Bill Browder. And more significantly, Putin talked about the Magnitsky Act, which Browder birthed with the help of the United States Congress. We often throw terms around today in our political and geopolitical debate, like capitalist and communist and oligarch. But very few who use these terms really understand the essence of what they mean. One of those that does understand is Bill Browder. He rebelled against communism as a teenager, became a very successful capitalist, and made millions in Putin's Russia. What he didn't know was just what kind of price he would pay for getting involved in the ever-entangled web of Putin, oligarchs, and a system 180 degrees from our own, a system of men and not of laws. The ultimate result was the brutal death of Browder's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Browder has since carried on Magnitsky's legacy at great personal risk to himself. And Putin's remarks underscore that Bill Browder's ongoing quest for justice for the murder of Sergei Magnitsky has taken a dark turn under the presidency of Donald Trump. It is my pleasure to welcome Bill Browder back to Radio Who, What, Why. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
For our listeners that may not know, real quickly, talk a little bit about the Magnitsky Act, what it was when it was passed in 2012, and why it so gets under Putin's skin to this very day.
Well, so after Sergei Magnitsky was murdered in 2009, I tried to get justice for him in Russia. And he was tortured to death. We had very, very detailed evidence of his torture from a variety of different sources. And I expected justice in Russia. But Vladimir Putin personally got involved in circling the wagons, in exonerating the people involved, and giving even promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit in Sergei's murder. And so I came up with this idea that if you can't get justice inside of Russia, let's try to get justice outside of Russia. And I looked at what happened, and I said, Sergei Magnitsky was killed not for ideological reasons or religious reasons. He was killed for money. He was killed because he had uncovered and exposed a $230 million government corruption scheme in which we later learned Putin was a beneficiary. And those people who killed him and did it for $230 million, they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money safely in Western banks in the United States and England and France and Switzerland and other places. And so I came up with this idea, which is if we can't get justice inside of Russia, why don't we freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who do similar types of things? And I took this idea to Washington, and I met with Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona. I explained to them the whole Magnitsky story and this idea of visa sanctions and asset freezes on human rights violators from Russia. And it was the perfect idea at the moment when it was most needed. And these two gentlemen initiated something called the Magnitsky Act. They put it onto the proposed law books in 2010, at the end of 2010, and then we spent sort of 2 years fighting our way through Washington to get everybody on side. And by November of 2012, it went for a vote in the Senate, and it passed 92-4, and 89% of the House of Representatives, and it was signed into law on December 14th, 2012 by President Obama. And Putin hit the roof, and I mean literally hit the roof. He got so angry, and he got so angry because he is personally a beneficiary of this crime, and he keeps his money in the West, and he has a lot of other money in the West from other crimes. And this particular piece of legislation puts his entire personal fortune at risk. And for Putin, money is more important than human life. And you may remember that he puts in retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. That was in direct retaliation to the Magnitsky Act. And he did that, and I should point out that these orphans that were no longer allowed to be adopted tended to be the orphans who were sick, that had Down syndrome, HIV, spina bifida, heart conditions, and Americans would still take them back to America with open arms and open hearts and nurse them to health. And in Russia, they couldn't do that, and these orphans often died in orphanages. And so, as a result, Putin was sentencing his own orphans to death in retaliation for the Magnitsky Act.
One of the things we should point out that this has also spread to other countries, that Canada recently adopted something similar to the Magnitsky Act, and that it is spreading to other countries, which is also driving Putin crazy.
Well, so you know, in his eyes, okay, maybe he can avoid putting money in America, but now we have Canada, we now have the United Kingdom, we now have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the island of Gibraltar off of Spain. So we have 7 countries with Magnitsky Acts, and there are 8 countries that are currently on deck: France, Germany, Sweden, Holland, Denmark, Australia, South Africa, and Ukraine. And I would venture to say that the Magnitsky Act, as a policy tool and as a piece of legislation, is going viral, and that makes Putin terrified, because effectively there's no place he'll be able to keep his money other than North Korea and Iran when this whole thing is finished. And I don't think he'd feel too comfortable and too safe with his money in North Korea and Iran.
All of this, of course, has increased his vendetta against you as really the progenitor of this. Talk a little bit about your reaction when you heard about Putin's remarks at this press conference in Helsinki last week.
Well, I should point out that after the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012 was the first moment that Putin started to speak about me publicly, and to speak about me with great anger. And so it wasn't a surprise for me to hear that Vladimir Putin was talking about me. The surprise was that Donald Trump was actually listening to and describing his proposal of handing me over as some type of brilliant idea. That was the surprising part of the whole thing. I mean, Putin has brought up my name, I think, 5 or 6 times in public settings, and you can even see the anger in his face when he brings it up. But Donald Trump saying, wow, an incredible offer, and nodding approvingly when Putin said that was the big surprise. Mm-hmm. I never thought that I would have to worry about being handed over to the Russians if I traveled to the United States.
And it wasn't only your name, it was some of the people, even staff members in the U.S. Congress, that had helped get this passed. These people he mentioned as well.
Well, so if you look at the list, Robert Mueller indicted 12 GRU agents for hacking the election. And his indictment was very clear. The evidence was absolutely robust. It came from emails and Bitcoin records and other stuff. And so the Russians made a list of 12 people they wanted to prosecute. Of course, I was the top of that list and the name that Putin rattled off during the Helsinki summit. But the 11 other people on that list all had one thing in common. They had all worked with me from the U.S. government in one way or another in either passing the Magnitsky Act or investigating the money laundering from the case that Magnitsky discovered in New York. And so, for example, you had Mike McFaul, who was one of the principal interlocutors in the Obama administration, who shepherded through the Magnitsky Act. You have a name that most people haven't heard of, but they should know about, which is a guy named Kyle Parker. Kyle Parker was the senior Senate staff member who wrote the Magnitsky Act. He wrote the Magnitsky Act, and he was the guy who ran all the traps for 2 years to make sure that the law passed. And often with a piece of legislation, of course, the senators who initiated it are the people bear the most responsibility, but there's always some unsung hero in the background, and Kyle Parker was that unsung hero. Then you have a guy named Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan Weiner had been a senior State Department official. He had become a lawyer in private practice, and he was the person who conceived of the Magnitsky Act. It was his legal advice that led to the whole thing. And then one more person I should mention on that side is a guy named David Kramer. He was a former State Department official who was running an NGO, a human rights organization called Freedom House. And Freedom House was with me every day, blocking and tackling and walking the halls of Congress to advocate for the Magnitsky Act. Mm-hmm. So that was on one side. And then on the other side, and this is perhaps even more heinous, is that you had 3 special agents from the Department of Homeland Security, a guy named Todd Hyman, another person named Schwartzman, and can't remember the name of the third person. These were special agents in the Department of Homeland Security whose job it was to investigate money laundering in the United States that originated from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over. And they found some of that money, and the Department of Justice froze that money, and the Russian perpetrators paid the U.S. Department of Justice $6 million to settle the case. And all of a sudden, these three people from the Department of Homeland Security are being asked by Putin for Donald Trump to hand them over. And so, I mean, I can't think of something more cynical than, I mean, Putin can ask for whatever he wants, but for Donald Trump to say that's an incredible offer to hand over these patriots, and these are all unsung heroes. These are all people who had been working in America for the U.S. government for no glory and for no money, in service to their country, to fight Russian organized crime and Russian murder and Russian money laundering, and to be handed over to the Russians is just beyond the pale.
The other part of it, small part of it, but an important fact nonetheless, is that Donald Trump can have no authority over you at all. You're a British citizen.
Yeah, well, I mean that's kind of the little absurd loophole in this whole thing, which is that I although my accent is American, I moved to London 29 years ago and became British, and I've been living there ever since. And so it's not as if that Putin can really even ask Donald Trump to hand me over. I mean, I spend 95% of my life in the UK, and so he actually Putin went to the wrong head of state. If he really wants me handed over, he should go to Theresa May. And I should point out that Putin did go to Theresa May and various other prime ministers in the UK before Theresa May. The Russian administration went 12 times with the same request to the British government, and both David Cameron's government and Theresa May's government didn't think it was an incredible offer at all. They rejected it within 5 seconds, the 12 different requests for either handing me over for extradition or mutual legal assistance or other things. And so, of course, I feel totally legally protected in the UK on the basis of that, and so that's why Trump's behavior, in contrast to that, was so shocking.
The accusation that Putin made in Helsinki about you having given $400 million to Hillary Clinton's campaign, had you heard that before? And what was your reaction to it if you had?
Well, yes. I had heard something similar to that before, because this is the spin that the Russians have been putting out there for quite a while. If you remember, 2 years ago, there was a meeting at Trump Tower between a lawyer, a Putin crony lawyer, and Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner, and they were pumping out this talking point then, and they continued to now. And I should point out that this $400 million is an absurdity. It's complete nonsense. I've not donated one single penny to Hillary Clinton's campaign or any other campaign for that matter. As I mentioned before, I'm a British citizen. I've been living in the UK for 29 years. I have no financial involvement, nor am I allowed to have a financial involvement in U.S. politics. And so for them to throw that out there, it's just the ultimate in just complete fabrication and fake news.
You mentioned that Trump Tower meeting and the Russian lawyer, Natasha Veselnitskaya. What was her involvement, as you understand it, in terms of her relationship with Putin?
Well, what we can say for sure is, so she is a lawyer for a family called the Kotsev family. The Kotsev family is a Russian family in which the senior member of the Kotsev family, his name is Pyotr Kotsev, was the former vice governor of the Moscow region. He's currently a vice president of Russian Railways. Russian Railways is one of the 2 or 3 most important Russian state companies. And he's considered by many people, and certainly by myself, to be a senior member of the Putin regime. And the way that Putin delegates tasks is he asks oligarchs and cronies to go and do his bidding for him. And so, in my opinion, he asked Kotsev to send Veselnitskaya to go in and do this whole anti-Magnitsky campaign, which she did with great vigor and with great resources, and hired lots of fancy lobbyists and smear campaigners and lawyers to go and try to make this thing go away and to try to destroy my reputation and to try to change the law. And thankfully, the facts were so clearly understood on the right side of this thing that nothing bad ever happened, but it wasn't for lack of trying on the side of the Russians.
Understanding Putin and understanding Russia as you do, talk a little bit about what you make of what you have seen transpire with respect to Donald Trump and Russia and Putin over the past year and a half.
Well, so what do we know 100% for sure? We know 100% for sure, which is not disputed by anybody, that Vladimir Putin had taken sides in the U.S. election. He had taken sides on behalf of Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. He took that side because he wanted sanctions to be lifted, and particularly the Magnitsky sanction to be lifted. And in taking sides, he also took great effort, or made great effort, in manipulating the outcome. He, as we know, they hacked the DNC. They were involved in all this social media with Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. And we know they also tried to penetrate the voting machines in various states around the United States. That's what we know for sure. That's proven. That's agreed. There's nobody really disputing that. Not even Donald Trump at this point. Or he and some days he disputes it, some days
right.
He doesn't. What we don't know for sure, and I have no firm opinion on this, is whether he did this with the acceptance and acknowledgement of the Trump campaign and Donald Trump himself, or whether he did this freelancing just because he had a view of who he wanted. That we don't know. And I could speculate, and lots of people can speculate, and the probabilities go up and down based on different pieces of information. But the person who will be able to conclude one way or another whether that happened is Robert Mueller. That's what the investigation is about. And he literally has 10,000 times the information and investigative capacity than any of us lay people do with whatever leaks out here and there. And he will be wiretapping, and he has been wiretapping and subpoenaing and interviewing and getting witnesses to flip, and sooner or later we will have an answer to that question, and it will be a very important answer because it will determine the future of the U.S. Republic as to whether Russia just was taking sides on their own, or whether taking sides with the involvement of one of the candidates.
What impact has this Putin-Trump relationship had on you and your efforts to continue getting the Magnitsky Act put in place in other countries around the world?
Well, first of all, I would say I should point out to everybody that the Magnitsky Act itself is not in danger no matter what Trump's actions are, because the Magnitsky Act was not a piece of legislation that was put in place by executive order by the stroke of the pen of the president. This was a piece of legislation that was put in place as an act of Congress, and Congress would have to vote in a majority way to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And I can say with great confidence that that's not going to happen. I know members of Congress, and there's no way that Republican, Democrat, anybody will ever repeal the Magnitsky Act. I should also point out that while Trump is making all these loving noises towards Vladimir Putin, his administration is not. His Secretary of State, Pompeo, his Secretary of Defense, Mattis, his Secretary of Treasury, Mnuchin, his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, none of these people have anything other than disdain for Vladimir Putin and his malicious activities towards the United States and the rest of the world. And they have been enforcing policies which are clearly and objectively anti-Putin. And so, for example, in April of this year, the Trump administration put 7 Russian oligarchs, some of the richest men in Russia, on the on the sanctions list. And on the sanctions list, those people are effectively financially devastated. And that's probably been the most single powerful move any government has taken at any point against Russia. In addition, the U.S. government has supplied offensive weapons to Ukraine, and even recently increased the military aid to Ukraine. And there was an absolutely devastating attack by the U.S. military in Syria against Russian mercenaries, where they effectively evaporated 300 mercenaries in one moment because they were going after U.S. allies. The U.S. has so far, and the Trump administration has so far taken a pretty tough stand on Russia. What's weird and totally inconsistent, and I would go so far as to argue schizophrenic, is this weird these words that Donald Trump and these words and now these visuals of Donald Trump somehow kowtowing to Putin personally, and that's extremely disturbing, and that's very upsetting. And if that does filter into policy, that could be really, really bad for the United States and the rest of the world.
And as somebody that understands and knows Putin, talk a little bit about how you think he is dealing with this schizophrenia, that he seems to manipulate Trump and gets Trump to say these things on the one hand, as we saw in Helsinki last week, and yet the policy, as you articulated, is very different. How is Putin responding to this, or how will he respond to it, do you think?
Well, I think that Putin understands that the establishment, the people who are the responsible adults who are dealing with this stuff, are against him, and he's trying to find a way of getting Trump to turn that around. And Putin is a very long-term player. He's not playing in the short term, and he clearly thinks that he has Trump's sympathies, and he wants to use that so that all these nice words actually filter into policy. And he'll play the long game as he does, and he's going to continue to try to do this. And I think that I think both Putin and Trump realize that this last summit, while was kind of great benefit to Putin in terms of theatrics, may have been a bit of a disaster in terms of the reaction, and so that's why I think they're both going for a second summit in the fall in the United States.
And finally, Bill, what are you worried about personally as a result of all of this in this relationship, and what should the U.S. and the West in general worry about?
Well, I'm worried personally that one way or another they're going to get the Russians, Vladimir Putin's going to get his hands on me and get me back to Russia and kill me in a Russian prison the way they did Sergei Magnitsky. And they've tried using Interpol, they've tried using these mutual legal assistance and extradition requests. And I'm worried that one day my luck will run out. I've been very lucky so far and that the world has been on my side. The Interpol has rejected all Russia's requests. Britain has rejected all of Russia's requests. The United States has rejected all of Russia's requests. I'm worried that someday that might change, and that's why this is that Putin's indecent proposal to Trump in Helsinki was really not a good thing for me. In terms of overall, I think that Putin. He's got such degrees of freedom that any other head of state doesn't have. He doesn't have any electorate to worry about, no press, no laws, no courts. He can do whatever he wants. And Putin is out there manipulating not just the U.S. election, but the Germans, the French. He's sending refugees out of Syria all over Europe to destabilize democracies. He's creating all sorts of nationalism and supporting far-right and far-left candidates. And he's trying to ruin, since he can't bring Russia up to the level of the West, he wants to bring the West down to the level of Russia. And he's had great success so far, and if he carries on, it could get a lot worse, and we could end up in a situation where he's created little fascist enclaves all over the place that we never even thought about. And then one day we're going to have a third world war because of that. The First World War started with the assassination of one obscure royal member of the royalty in Europe, and that's how things work. And people are saying we should be talking to Russia and be nice to Russia because they've got nuclear weapons. No, we should be containing Russia and not letting them do all this stuff to start World War III.
Bill Browder, I thank you so much for spending time with us today on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.